width. So, as far as possible, I've got the picture to the left. So what I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about the island where my mother's family comes from. And I decided to talk a bit about the fortifications. So the island is Guernsey, and according to the locals there, it's the most fortified place in the world. And I will show you why. So first of all, where is Guernsey? Can you see my cursor or not?
Yes.
Okay. So here's England, here's Normandy, and these are the British Channel Islands. Everybody, I think, is familiar with Jersey because of New Jersey. There is Guernsey. This island up there is Alderney, and it's part of the administrative area of Guernsey. There is no New Guernsey in the US, but there is Guernsey County, Ohio, and a cousin of mine, distant cousin, managed to trace a relative of mine in Guernsey County, Ohio. This is the ancestor moved there in 1801. So it's a long time ago, but there they are. There's a picture of the islands from satellite. This is what is termed the bailiwick of Guernsey, the administrative area. It's centered on Guernsey, but it includes these other islands. There, to give you some idea of the size of Guernsey, it's really pretty small. So as you see, it's just under 8 miles across there and 6 there. So if you go in this direction, you've got about maybe 10 miles, but to follow a coast road all the way is a lot more than that. So here's an actual more accurate map. So it gives you some idea with regard to how the island was fortified. On the south coast is all steep cliffs. The northwest facing coast is all a rocky coast. And this is a very sheltered harbor out here, which has been probably used, for way over 1,000 years. But the invasion of anybody here would be somewhat difficult along these cliffs, possible here, but only on a small scale because of all these rocky bays. But nonetheless, it has been a very fortified island. There is the island from the air. It used to be agricultural, but now there are so many houses everywhere, much like other places. That's what the south coast looks like. And this is a modern picture of the harbor and the town. At the entrance to the harbor, there is this small island with a castle on it. And this castle has been there since the 13th century. Wow. So way back then, its defenses were important. The basic history of the island is that it was part of the Duchy of Normandy. So the Duke of Normandy invaded England in 1066 and became the King of England. And for 200 years, Normandy and England were the same country, if you like, actually ruled from London. But then there was the new King of France had war with the King of England, and England lost Normandy, and it reverted back to the King of France. But the islands, these Channel Islands, as part of the treaty in the middle of the 13th century, remained part of the British Isles, even though they are much closer to France. So at that point, England and France were at war. So the defenses started, and this was one that started in the middle of the 1200s. It was originally an island, and was not connected to the mainland. And there is a picture dated 1672, and you see a classic fort of that era. However, in that year, the keep, that's the tower in the center, which was typical of medieval castles, was destroyed when lightning struck the powder magazine, and there was a giant explosion which demolished the keep in 1672, and it was never rebuilt. So there's what the island looked like in 1814. It is still an island. And now we start to see the development of more fortifications because of the British-French wars during the Napoleonic era. There's what it looks like today. The castle is now connected to the mainland. It's now part of the harbor, and there is a breakwater extending beyond it. So this is still the 13th century castle with additions in the 1600s, further additions during the Napoleonic Wars, and even further additions during the Second World War when the Germans built concrete fortifications. An interesting bit of history was in the middle of the 1600s, during the British Civil War, the castle was controlled by the royalists. The British Civil War was the king versus a very sort of Puritan parliament for about 10 years. And the island supported the royalists, the castle supported the royalists, and the island was controlled by the parliamentarians. And so they were at war, and the castle kept shelling the little town on the island. And over a period of 8 years, they fired 500 cannonballs at the island. Finally, the royalists, the Civil War finished, and the two were again united. So we now move to the more Napoleonic Wars. So there are many castles all over the island. Most of them are in semi-ruin, but there's one there. But the other thing that's all around the island is there were these watchtowers built, and you can see the distance. They were built within sight of each other all around the island. They had beacons on the top to transmit the information. They were clearly defensive, as you see from these holes all the way around. And these were built to prevent an invasion by the French in the period 1780 to about 1812. And they're very common all the way around. Some of them, most of them are blocked off, but there are some that are now open to tourists. There's one that is actually refurbished inside, and you can see that there's a door and a flagpole on the top. It looks as if it's built to be occupied. There's even a little chimney on the top. There are forts all the way around the island. There is, and this would be a much more modern, this is probably German on the top of this Napoleonic era fort. Some have been restored just for the tourists. So there you can see cannons typical of the early 19th century. So here again, here's another fort. This on the far hill is a German structure. There's the magazine on one of these forts. from 1780 to 1812, a huge fort was constructed above the town. It's called Fort George, and this was to house a large militia of troops to guard against an invasion from the French, but the invasion never came, but it was a very fortified island at this time. There's what part of it looks like today. And I'll show you right at the end what it has become. But this fort kept going into the early 1900s and then was essentially abandoned. So by the time of the Second World War, there were no troops on the island. So in the only part of Britain that was occupied by the Germans during the Second World War were these Channel Islands. And after the start of the Second World War, the invasion of the islands started, and it was on the 28th of June, 1940. The war started. So the war had been going on, but hadn't really had any impact on the people. The war had been going on for about 9 months.
That bombing was 80 years ago today.
Oh, well, so it was. Yes. All right. So we now have this day in history. So what you see here is in the 1930s, and in fact through the 1950s, the main produce of this island was horticultural. And because it's a somewhat warmer climate than Britain, greenhouses, vast acres of greenhouses were built on this island, and they raised tomatoes. And the harvest started in May, maybe even April, because they planted the plants very early, and they hit the vegetable market before the garden ones came in, which would be sort of late July. And so what you see here is this is a road leading to the harbor, and these were all trucks filled with boxes of tomatoes ready to be carried to the mainland on a ferry. It's about a 6-hour journey. And even in the 1950s, I remember as a boy, vast numbers of these trucks lined up doing the main export. This market collapsed in the early 1970s because the cost of fuel went way up, and also the Dutch seemed to be more efficient in doing it. So this market for tomatoes has totally gone now. There are some horticultural crops that are grown. It is one of the world's biggest producers of clematis plants, for example. But that is a picture taken after the bombing. So here is a photo taken at the time. At the time, they knew an invasion was coming, and they were trying to get as many people as possible off the island, particularly women and children. So at the time of the bombing, the people were lined up to get the last boat out. And here is the harbor as of 1929. This is the town. And this jetty here was constructed in 1929. And this is what saved most of the people, because this jetty had 2 levels. At high tide, the lower level is covered, but it's uncovered. The concrete slabs. At low tide, there's an underneath concrete slab. So they had a foot of concrete above, and it was low tide. So when the bombing came, everybody rushed to the lower level of the jetty, and the majority survived because of that. If it had been high tide, the crowds on there trying to get the last boat out would have been many higher casualties. Now, some of you may have seen the movie the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Society movie. Anybody seen that movie? I don't think so. Okay, well, it's a story about the war, but because this harbor has so changed, and now I'll show you right at the end, it's essentially a marina. They couldn't film it there, and they picked some tiny harbor in Cornwall to pretend it was the Guernsey harbor, but it looked nothing like it. This is still a major harbor. Really big liners cannot come in. It's on the sort of the cruise line circuit, but they have to moor off and bring people in on smaller boats. But you can get channel ferries that sort of go between France and England in there very easily at this new jetty. So that's what saved the people. Anyhow, here is a picture of taken in 1965. So by 1965, very little had changed, and you can still see this new jetty which saved these people during the bombing. And it shows the relation now of Castle Cornet here, and that the fact that probably in the early 1900s, this was built right out here. So it's now connected to the land. Anyhow, okay, on we go. 3 days later, after this bombing, the Germans invaded, and the island was abandoned by the British troops. There was no attempt to fight off the Germans. So the Germans just walked in. But they then the Germans decided that they were going to fortify this island. And the way they did it was through essentially slave labor, forced laborers. And this was a part of an organization called Organization Todt, which Todt was an engineer in the German army, and he conceived of this idea of building this vast network of defense using forced labor. Most of these forced laborers you see here are not islanders. They brought in Eastern Europeans, particularly from Poland. This is a picture taken in Warsaw in 1941 of the deportation of men living in Warsaw. They're rounded up by the Germans. Oopsie, let me go back. Being rounded up by the Germans, put on trucks. And they went off to be the construction laborers for the German war machine in Western Europe and including the Channel Islands. Many of these laborers are reported to have died in the Channel Islands because the conditions were so harsh. So here is a German map of the islands, put together obviously by a historian, giving you some idea of the fortifications they built all the way around the island. So it became an extremely heavily fortified island because they wanted to prevent an invasion by the British and the Americans, who came in, of course, a bit later. But when the invasion of Normandy occurred, they simply jumped the Channel Islands. The Allied forces simply ignored them. But so then I'm now going to go through a few of the pictures. Some of these German fortifications, quite a few are on public land. The entire coastline of Guernsey is public, apart from, I think, there's one or two very small areas that are not, but it's virtually all public. But there's also a lot of these fortifications on private land, and I've never seen those. There are some tours now where you can visit some of these. But they took these Napoleonic forts and fortified them. Virtually all the German fortifications, roughly where my arrow is, you can see the modernization. They were built with 6 foot thick concrete. Yeah. reinforced concrete to withstand artillery shells or bombing. So here's another view of that. And you can see the concrete here put underground and these gun emplacements to guard against invasion from the sea. The island has towers all the way around. Now this one was put on top of one of these Napoleonic towers. Some were built from scratch, some they used the foundations, but they all have these gun slits. There would be guns on every level pointing out to sea against an invasion. There's one of the biggest ones built into the cliffs, and many of these are sort of ruins, but some of them have been rehabilitated simply for tourist purposes. I don't know of any that have actually been knocked down. They've decided to leave them simply because this is island history. And there's two of them on the cliffs that you can see there. And there's one built on the base of a Napoleonic era tower. You walk the cliffs, you see these all over the place. Most of them were also built underground to camouflage them, but also to provide extra protection from bombing from the air. But they were never bombed. They were never attacked. So here's one right next to a beach. And this is the one that yours truly is inspecting at that point when my brother happened to take a picture. This is probably in the about 2000 and 2004, I think, that picture. Now the islanders were certainly pretty deprived, but they often went quite hungry, but they kept up with what is happening because they all had these little crystal radios or the equivalent. And so would use this to listen to the BBC. This is a museum of artifacts from the occupation period. And one of my mother's friends says that they used to keep this equipment hidden up the chimney, because if you were discovered with this equipment, you were going to be sent to one of the concentration camps in Europe, because it was absolutely prohibited to listen to the BBC. So here you will see one of these little radios with a man who was a boy during that, pointing out how they used these radios. Some food was brought in under the Red Cross, and the main providers of the food coming in, as you will see here, where my cursor is, the Canadian Red Cross Society. I do note that these raisins are from the US, I think. I don't know where, but when I was a boy in London during the war, I thought eggs were a yellow powder that came in a can and things like that. But it did enable the locals to survive the war. My grandparents' house was occupied by German troops because they had a fairly nice house, and the officers lived there. And the piano that was in the room still had the beer stains of the German soldiers' mugs on the top of the piano. This is one of the guns. Most of the guns have all gone. This is one that either survives or was brought back. This is a fairly small one, and some of them were much bigger, but as I said, they were never used. Gun emplacements like this are all over the place. Well, the whole occupation finished on May the 9th, 1945, when the island was, of course, France had already been occupied by the Allied troops, so the island was completely surrounded. And so a British warship arrived on May the 9th, 1945, and the Germans, realizing that the war was essentially over for them, surrendered essentially without a shot being fired. So here are the Germans marching out of one of their, this is a fortification from the Napoleonic era, modified, and these are the German soldiers walking out and surrendering to the British troops. When I went there a year later, that was the first time I went, 1946, there were still German troops being marched around. I guess they were being used to just do various construction projects or repair projects. Here is a picture of the islanders in the town celebrating after the Germans had surrendered. And here is the arrival of the main British force after the surrender. And this is, you can still see one of the cranes. So this must be near the harbor, and that looks like a mast there. And these are the British troops marching in a couple of days after the Germans surrendered to the British warship. So what does it look like now? Well, Fort George was the main Napoleonic fort, was in fact sold off in 1967 to a developer who put a large number of luxury houses up there. And so here we see the Napoleonic era constructions on Fort George. There's a magazine there. These are gun emplacements, German gun emplacements from the Second World War. And here's one of the luxury homes on the top. If you have 2 or 3 million, you can buy one of those. They'll all have a view over the islands. It's very, very nice view. So, but here's what the harbor looks like now. You can see here still the castle, the new jetty. This may even be a few years old because it still has cranes. But now you have a modern ferry terminal here. Almost everything comes in by truck, and the ferries simply drive the containerized trucks. There's where the ferry, the trucks unload right there. But what you'll see mainly is this is all new. It's 20 years old. It's now essentially a marina berths, huge numbers of marina berths. This is where the money is now. Tourism, but even and offshore banking. One of the main industries in the island in the late 1700s was piracy, and it still is. Anyhow, because I trust Ken is still with us, I thought I would give a little bit of more military history. And this is a Guernseyman called Major General Sir Isaac Brock. And Brock grew up in Guernsey, joined the British Army, and was in Canada from 1802 to 1812. And Ken, you're probably fairly close to Brockville.
Ah, interesting.
And Brockville is, there's Brockville, Brock University, and it's all named after this man who became the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. I don't know when he did, but probably around 18. He was there for a few years before he got this position. So
I'll have to look that one up.
Do you want to tell us what Upper Canada is?
It's downstream of the area that I am in the Thousand Islands. Brockville is maybe 20 miles downstream from the Canadian Bridge.
Yeah. But now, how about
island.
Upper Canada? What is Upper Canada?
Farther down, I can't define the region per se.
No, Actually, I had to look this up, Ken. Upper Canada is essentially modern day Ontario.
Okay,
Lower Canada was the Maritimes, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick.
you got me.
So I guess the Canadian settlers started there and moved up, sort of upstream a bit. But Upper Canada is on, they say, or more or less equivalent to modern Ontario.
Well,
Anyhow, Brock.
the term Upper Canada today is most associated with Upper Canada Village. That tends to recreate the old history of what it used to be like.
Okay, well, Brock was the commander of the Canadian forces during the War of 1812, and he had a success. This upper picture is the Battle of Detroit, and this is Brock, and Brock's forces won, and this is the American general, I don't have his name, surrendering to Brock in August 1812. But then later on, October 1812, there was the Battle of Queenston Heights, which again is be fairly near where you are, I think, between the British forces representing Canada and the American forces, and Brock was killed in I think I have October the 13th, 1812. So that is the connection between Guernsey and the area in which you live, Ken. So I thought that was, I found, and there is a, near where my grandparents' house was, there is a Brock Road in Guernsey. So he's one of the most famous of the Guernseymen. So there we are. Okay, so I'll stop share. So if anybody has any questions, I can do my best to answer them.
Where did the term Guernsey cow come from?
Oh, well, it was very much an agricultural society up to certainly 1900. And so there were many farms. My great-grandfather was a farmer. I know very little about him, but a cousin, second cousin, has found several newspaper reports that he liked his drink, and he was often arrested for being drunk or disorderly or being involved in pub brawls. But he was a farmer, and I have pictures of the farmhouse, which dated from the 1500s. So even today, there are small farms with cows, and that Guernsey was the origin of that breed. And it is still the center of the breed. One of the local rules is that no cattle can be imported into the island because it would contaminate the breed. So it's a breed with very high butter fat. There's a local enthusiast we have here, Dr. Joe Piskarowski, a dentist, keeps a herd of Guernsey cattle. And up a few years ago, and I can't remember when, maybe before the Second World War, the biggest herd of Guernseys was up near Geneva, New York. The world's biggest herd of Guernsey cows. But the Guernsey cow is literally a cow from a breed developed in Guernsey. There's also a Jersey cow, which is more of a brownie, sort of buff colored, more than the gold brown. So that's where that comes from. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well done. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, my goodness. Very impressive.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity to learn so much today.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah,
okay, well,
Lee, yeah.
now-
I too.
Now, Ken, you've got to give us a history of the Thousand Islands sometime and all these castles that are on it.
Well, one of these days.
But
you'll get
anyhow,
it.
now you know where Brockville comes from, if you didn't before.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to end the
Rise and
recording
walk.
here. Let's give Peter a hand. Great
Okay.
hand. Thank you for checking off one of our bucket list items that we didn't know we had.
Okay, well, it is 2:02, so as I was chairing this, but didn't give you much beyond that, it is time to quit. So thank you.